So welcome everyone to our webinar. This is the final webinar in the series that we've been hosting this summer, our Melios Insights series. And today's webinar is all about starting secondary school and how to support your child's mental health. I'm Rebecca Kinnear. I'm the clinical lead for our treatment services here at Melios, and I'm joined today by two of our assistant psychologists, Tyler and Shelby, who will introduce themselves as we move through the webinar today. Next slide, please, Shelby. So just a little introduction to us. We are Melios. We are a private service offering mental health support and assessments and autism and ADHD assessments. We offer post-diagnostic support and different talking therapies, including CBT and integrative therapy. If you are interested in hearing any more about the services that we offer, please do visit the website. You can see it here on the slide, melios.org.uk, or feel free to get in touch with us after the webinar today. That's it from me. I will now hand over to Tyler and Shelby, who will take us through the webinar. Thank you both.
Hi, thank you, Rebecca. I'm Tyler. So in regards to today's webinar, I'd like you to keep this quote in your mind as we go through our webinar. Your life is a story of transition. You are always leaving one chapter behind while moving on to the next. And I think that's quite an appropriate message for this sort of webinar in that sense. Yeah, next slide, lovely. So what to expect in today's webinar. So we're going to introduce transitions, what they are, we'll go through some examples and why they're significant. Then we'll go through why transitions can be tricky for young people and how it can be challenging. Then we'll also look at how transitions can be positive as well. Then we'll be looking at the window of tolerance. Then we'll go through some general tips and general sort of strategies as well for anxiety, negative thoughts, and emotional regulation that you can use during this transition. Then we'll be discussing some further resources and some other places you can get some additional information from. Yeah, so transitions. What are transitions? So transitions are periods of major life change that can change relationships, structures, routines, roles, identity, and so on. And some examples can include moving house, family changes such as a new sibling, even starting secondary school, which is what we'll be focusing on for today. And why is it important? Well, within this transitional period, children can find it challenging to cope as it's such a significant point in their lives. Research has shown it's one of the most difficult transitions in children's educational careers. And I suppose with that in mind, I'd like you to just reflect on some questions as we go through this webinar. First, I'd like you just to reflect on what are some transitions that have occurred in your own life. So by this, I mean, it could be moving jobs, potentially moving cities, maybe moving countries even. Then I'd like you to reflect on your own experiences of this primary to secondary school transition and how it affected you. Then I'd like you to also reflect on what would have helped to make a difference to you during that time, what support was helpful, what support could have been helpful, and just reflect on the different roles teachers and parents had during that time. Yeah, and just after a moment reflecting on that, I'd like to now introduce a bit about what are the practical changes associated with this transition. So there's quite a few associated with the primary to secondary school transition. For example, academic changes, as there's lots of new pressures, new curriculum, there's a lot more homework from different classes. There's of course the organisational and routine changes, as there's a new timetable that they have to follow, there's different ways to school. And of course, there's the environmental changes, new classrooms, there's a bigger school and a bigger place to navigate, maybe a new area. And as well, there's more people as well to try and go through. And of course, the social changes, as there's new peers, there's new friends, lots of different social dynamics. and lots of different teachers as well. And of course, as well, puberty. In that sense, the emotional, physical changes associated with puberty have a massive impact on children during this time, as it's a bit of a perfect emotional sort of storm in that sense, because you're dealing with all these changes and those sort of changes as well.
Great, thanks, Tyler. So it's nice to meet everybody. My name's Shelby, and I'm also an assistant psychologist. I thought it'd be helpful just to think about the transition for special educational needs children. So obviously the transition can be tricky for all, but with special educational needs and disabilities, there may be some additional challenges and complexities in the transition to secondary school. Some of these might be due to loss of routine. So as Tyler mentioned, there's obviously a lot more teachers involved, there's constant room changes, timetables are a lot more complex than they would be in primary school. There's also an increased need for independence. So secondary school pupils are more independent in terms of bringing in their own belongings, making sure they bring in the correct books on specific days, managing deadlines and homework portals on their own. Sensory overwhelm as well. So the environmental scale or size of the school can be very different from primary school. And the school itself, in terms of the hallways being very busy, lockers, maybe the doors slamming, things like that, cafeterias, even the school bell, and the change to uniform. So a lot of schools may have blazers or ties that are really uncomfortable. And when people have sensory needs, this can be an additional challenge on that transition as well. Lastly, changes to peer groups, as well as Tyler mentioned, that change in friendships, needing to make new friends, and also being in classes that may be a lot larger, or a school year that's a lot larger, can be an additional challenge. There are things that can help though. So requesting extra visits beforehand. Similarly, transition days, so having those extra days to settle in, prepare, kind of get used to the classroom and teachers can help. Identifying a safe space or person in the school that they can go to if they're struggling. And in terms of just the timetable being a lot more complex and not knowing the building, colour coding the timetable can be really helpful.
Thank you, Shelby. So following that, I'd like to now discuss with you, what does a positive transition to secondary school look like? So with this in mind, a positive transition consists of three main elements. Firstly, it consists of feeling like they belong. So by that I mean that could include your child knows the names of key staff, like their form tutor. They know who to talk to if they have a problem. They talk positively about joining clubs, trying new activities, and engaging in subjects. In addition, that they're able to navigate and handle their new surroundings. So this could be they're able to read the new timetable, they know how to get to school on their own or with new friends, they can find classrooms without getting lost all the time. And finally, the last element is being independent. So by that I mean is to help sort of build their independence. So this could be packing their own school bag the night before, using an alarm clock to wake up on time. They do the homework without you needing to check on them every day, and just helping them build those routines.
Thanks, Tyler. So if you joined our webinar on Tuesdays, Anya would have covered the window of tolerance there, but we're going to go through it again today. The window of tolerance is essentially a concept that describes optimal functioning. So when somebody's in their window of tolerance, they're in a psychological space that allows them to perform activities without their emotions and thoughts becoming overwhelming or interfering with their function. Your window size or your window of tolerance isn't fixed, and it can be affected by stress. So things like a transition to secondary school can make that window of tolerance a bit smaller. I thought it would be helpful to think of some examples in the transition to secondary school in the different zones. So I'm not sure if you can see my mouse on the screen, but I'm pointing to the different zones. The top one, so hyperarousal, or the fight or flight zone, if we're thinking about being lost in the school, so lost in the building or in the noisy hallway, if somebody's in the hyperarousal or fight or flight zone, they may become very panicky. They may get very upset quite quickly. Whereas if they were in that optimal zone or their window of tolerance, they may still feel anxious, but they'd be more likely to ask for help or to be able to find somebody who can help them. Similarly, in the hypoarousal, so the bottom one, or the shutdown kind of freeze zone, if in a different example, let's say they were worried about not fitting in, they might isolate themselves. They might shut down even more, become very frozen or numb to the kind of experience, disconnected from their classmates. Whereas if they're in that optimal zone or that window of tolerance, they may be more willing to introduce themselves. They might push themselves out of their comfort zone and make new friends. As I said a minute ago, obviously the window of tolerance isn't fixed, so that can change. And we can also change through the zones as well, throughout the day, throughout weeks, kind of whenever. We can support people to be in that optimal zone as well through practical things like we've already said around transition days, helping to prepare, normalizing feelings as well, so that this is actually quite a stressful time for people, and understanding that other people might be worried as well, but also in more practical strategies like grounding or emotional regulation techniques that we're going to think about a little bit later in today's webinar.
Thank you, Shelby. So now we're going to discuss some general tips to make the transition easier for you and for your child. So first, a good tip is preparation. So by that, I mean being aware of strategies that can help, such as self-care techniques, awareness of how anxiety and low mood looks like in yourself and your child, potentially as well visiting the school in advance and talking about the structure of the new timetable, of the new routines, and being open about all these new changes together. And then the second tip is encouragement. So by that, I mean praising your child, building their sort of curiosity and understanding of these new changes, and giving them time to adjust to all these new changes and challenges together. And in addition, it could be really helpful as well, making sure that they engage in hobbies that they really enjoy, meeting up with primary school friends and making sure that there's regular contact there as well, and just providing reassurance as well on what they're doing well and can make all the difference. And alongside that as well, growing their independence can be really helpful for this transition. So building their confidence, and you can do this through building routines such as getting their bag packed the night before school, maybe making breakfasts together, organising when they do homework, and just building that together. So now I'm just going to go over a couple of techniques regarding anxiety and uncertainty and what can help with that. So the first one I'll be discussing is the worry box. So the worry box is a really good tool as it helps kids to notice, name, and let go of worries they can't control. It can help them create distance between themselves and their fears. For this technique, you can find an old box or a container and decorate it together, which can be really fun and creative as well. Then you would cut a hole in the box where the worries would be posted. Then you would agree on times to discuss the worries and acknowledge them together. So this could be at the end of the week, in the mornings, weekends. And you can also use this technique for positive and exciting thoughts as well. Another technique that can be really good is body mapping. So body mapping is a really good tool as well, as it helps children understand their anxiety. So you would draw bodies on a piece of paper and use colours and symbols to illustrate, I suppose, how they're feeling. So they would mark where they feel physical signs of anxiety or stress. And you could sort of explain this as our bodies give us clues when it's stressed. Some examples can include feeling shaky, tensing your jaw, your eyes are straining, similar to things like that. For example, for the eyes straining, you could use the colour red around and draw around the eyes in that sense. And this can be a really good opportunity as well to be curious with your child about their emotions and how they recognise and experience them and what can help in that as well. And you can also do an example with yourself as well and sort of bond with them on that front.
Thanks, Tyler. So now we're going to think a bit about negative thoughts or unhelpful thinking patterns. So this might be things we all do. Well, it is things we all do. But we're going to think of 4 specific examples that are quite common. In the next slide, we're also going to think about how we challenge those. So the first one is overgeneralizing. So this is when a single negative experience, like getting lost on the way to class, leads to making broad, sweeping conclusions about the future or their overall abilities. So the example on the slide is, I didn't know where my first class was. I'm always going to get lost for every class now. The next one is disqualifying the positive. So this is when people actively reject, dismiss, or transform positive experiences into negative ones. So an example is, it doesn't matter that I did well in science because I did badly in maths. The next one is jumping to conclusions. So you can break these down into 2 different kind of types. So sometimes we may do mind reading, which is assuming others are thinking the worst. So the example is, peers looked at me and laughed, and then I immediately assumed they're laughing at me, when actually they didn't even notice them. Fortune telling, so predicting a negative outcome before it happens. The example on the screen is, I know I'm going to fall over in the cafeteria tomorrow in front of everybody. And then lastly, personalisation. So this is when we blame ourselves for a negative event that was completely outside of our control. So an example might be, my history teacher looked really angry at the start of class. It must be because I've done something wrong. Now, these are obviously just examples, but they may be things that you've noticed yourself doing before or your child doing. And we're going to think about how we can challenge these in the next slide. So there's lots of different ways we can challenge negative thoughts. We're going to go through 3 examples now. So one is the good news jar, and this can be particularly helpful in terms of kind of disqualifying the positive. So when people tend to focus on the bad or change a positive thing into a negative. So placing an empty jar in a room and having your child write down one small win each day and dropping it inside. Then on those tough days or at the end of the school week, you can dump the jar out together and review those physical evidence of their successes that week and what's gone well. The next one is putting the thought on trial. So this is a bit like thinking of the negative thought in a courtroom. So you will get evidence for that thought. So if we think about the history teacher example, what's the evidence that the teacher was annoyed at you? And then what's the evidence against that thought? What's the evidence they weren't annoyed at you? And then you would use those examples to make a fair verdict. And usually it doesn't agree with that negative thought. And then the last one is decatastrophize. So I like to think about this as putting out the fire, which is why it's got the little fire symbol on the screen. Thinking about, well, what is the worst thing that could happen if that negative thought was true? So let's say you're worried your peers laughed at you. What's the worst thing that could happen if that's true? And then evaluate the likelihood of that worst thing happening. And then planning what you can do if that worst thing did happen. So instead of challenging the thought and its credibility, like put the thought on trial, you're actually making an active plan of, okay, so if this does happen, what can we do about it? And it can help somebody feel a bit more settled with those negative thoughts. Sometimes challenging negative thoughts can be difficult, and they don't always work depending on the situation. So it's helpful to think of more practical strategies too, which we're going to do on this slide. So we've got 2 emotional regulation strategies to think of. The first one is the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. This is a grounding exercise, so it's usually used to manage anxiety, panic, stress by anchoring you in the present moment. This is something that your child can do with themselves, so kind of asking themselves either out loud or in the head, or it's something you can guide them through. Sometimes it's helpful as the parent to guide them through it the first few times so they learn how to do it, and then when they are at school they'll remember how to do it. The idea is engaging your 5 senses and shifting focus away from those anxious or negative thoughts. So the example on the slide is 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, and 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. Essentially, you can do it in any order. There's no strict rule. It doesn't matter. And if you forget, it's not a problem. The idea is just that you're describing each bit in detail to distract from those negative thoughts. The next one we have is box breathing, which is a manual overriding of your nervous system. So it works by bringing your body back to a state of calm and balance by lowering your cortisol levels, so that stress hormone. It reduces your heart rate and can break that fight or flight stress cycle that we mentioned earlier. The example on the screen, hopefully it's counting down for you as well as me, but it's showing you how to do it. So essentially you inhale, so you breathe in slowly through your nose for a count of 4 seconds. Then you hold that breath for 4 seconds. You then exhale out of your mouth for 4 seconds, and then hold that breath with the empty lungs for 4 seconds. And you can repeat that cycle as many times as you need. Again, this is something that your child can do on their own, but it may be something you help them with and guide them through the first few times. It can also be helpful to do these techniques before they're feeling anxious or distressed, so that they have that practice and know how to do it when they are feeling distressed. The important thing as well is obviously the example on the screen is showing you how to do it, but you don't need a visual. It's something you can picture in your head. You could trace anything square around you. So you could even just make a square with your finger. Could be tracing a book, tracing a whiteboard if they're in the classroom. It's something you can take anywhere. So we just wanted to take a minute now to remind you to look after yourselves too during this time. We acknowledge that it's exciting, but it can also be a big change for parents and caregivers as well as your children. It can mean closing a chapter on primary school and a change to your own routine and community. It might be stepping back and allowing your child to be a bit more independent, which can be difficult for some. Getting to know teachers and new online portals and things like that can also be an adjustment for parents. So just remember that you and your child or children are in it together. It might be helpful to think that you're moving into a new role of consulting rather than managing your child. So you're still needed, you're just needed in a different way. Some more practical tips that can help during the transition for parents or carers might be setting up coffee mornings or group chats for Year 7 parents. Helped with that change in routine and community, and also just maintaining your own routines, hobbies, and stress relief is important. Thanks, Tyler.
Oh, thank you, Shelby. So following that, I just want to now discuss about some key reflections and things to take away from today's webinar. Firstly, the transition is difficult, but it is really exciting. It can bring up a lot of new challenges, but it's really exciting as it's a time to grow, make new friends, become more independent, and to build their confidence and curiosity. It's a great time for loads of different things in that sense. And in addition, another thing to take away is preparation is key, as preparing for the move makes both you and your child feel more ready and able to tackle these big changes together. Next, it's important as well to utilize your toolkit. So you can keep the things we've covered in these webinars in your back pocket, like a little toolkit of how to support your child and yourself through this time. So just keeping in mind those anxiety techniques, the box breathing, and as well as those challenging those negative thoughts as well. And lastly, knowing when to get extra help, as knowing when those difficult feelings like worry or even sadness are impacting them a bit more than we might expect. If you feel those feelings are becoming unmanageable or impacting their day-to-day, then we would encourage you to get in touch with your GP or local CAMHS team if you're already open to them in that sense. Yeah, and following that, I just wanted to put on the screen here some further resources where you can read some additional information and some additional tips and tricks as well for this transition. As we've got here, we've got Young Minds, Anna Freud, Barnardo's, Place to Be, Sendias. And again, if you are concerned about your child's mental health, please do reach out to your GP for additional support as well.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, both. That was really insightful, and there were so many useful takeaways in there. So we're just going to move on to some questions now. So if you have any, please drop them into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of the screen. So we'll start with the one we've got here, which is, how long will it take for my child to settle into secondary school?
That's a really good question. I think the first thing to start with is it's not one size fits all. There's no specific answer. It can take anywhere from a few weeks to a year. It really depends on the child, their circumstances, obviously if there's additional needs. In general, in 1 to 2 weeks, they can get past that initial shock and kind of figuring out the layout and workings of secondary school. By 6 weeks, they might get more used to those routines, begin getting to know their teachers, timetables, peers. Usually by the end of the first term, so around that Christmas time, most will have started to feel settled. They'll have more comfort in friendships, kind of the change in teachers and everything like that. But for some, it may take longer, like I said. Obviously, if they've moved up alone, they may not have any peers that they know. They may not have siblings at the school or additional needs, like I mentioned. The transition time can be a bit longer. If obviously you're concerned, you know your child best. So if you feel they're struggling more than you would expect or are taking longer to adjust than maybe their siblings have, speaking with the school is a good idea. See how they can be supported better and maybe what is getting in the way of them settling in.
Perfect, thank you. So we've got another one. It's, how can I tell the difference between normal nerves and anxiety that means my child needs extra support?
That is another good question. I suppose it depends on lots of different things, but I suppose it depends on as well as how long those nerves are going on for, how persistent they are, if it's impacting their sleep, eating, general functioning, maybe they're withdrawing from school, hobbies and friends as well. And as typical sort of normal nerves, I suppose, are manageable with reassurance and that they're still engaging with sort of school friends and hobbies. So if you feel they are being impacted in that way and they're not going away, then I would say it would be good to speak to your GP for additional support, maybe the school as well. And it could be good as well to see what your local area has in terms of support groups as well.
That's great, thank you. So that's all the questions that we've got for now. So we'll end it there. Melios Insights is quite a new venture, so we'd really appreciate some feedback. You can either scan the QR code here, or we'll be sending out an email which will have the recording in it, and we'll include this link as well to the feedback form on there. So thank you so much for joining today, and we hope you enjoyed it.